Thank you. Good afternoon in some parts of the country. Good morning. Others. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. This is an exciting panel on guns, race, and social justice. I'm Matt Littman, Executive Director of 97%. Joining us today, we have Dr. Caroline Light from Harvard University, Charlie Cobb, I should say, veteran of student nonviolent coordinating, but also you wrote a great book called This Nonviolent Stuff Will Get You Killed, which I've read. It's really so packed with information. It's incredible. And Abené Clayton, a writer for The Guardian, and specifically the Guns and Lies series for The Guardian. So thank you, everybody, for joining us. Much appreciated. Charlie, I'm going to start off with you because, one thing we've seen lately in this last year is that the gun sales are through the roof. And specifically in the Black community, I think the increase is about 56% from where it was before, which is higher than in any other group. And so the reasons for that are there's a lot that's happened over the last year, and a lot of bad stuff, obviously, that's happened. There's a big self-defense component to this. You write about that in your book, This Nonviolent Stuff Will Get You Killed, this history of self-defense. Can you talk about, it goes back, according to you, hundreds of years, but do you mind talking about that today and how it applies to current times?
Well, certainly, the tradition of guns in the Black community, which is really a part of the tradition of guns in Southern communities, because guns have always been a big part of Southern culture, but specifically within the Black community it really has to do with two things. One is self-defense. Black communities have always been plagued by terrorists of various kinds. And contrary to popular thinking, the attitude has been, how do we defend ourselves best from this? There are countless stories of Blacks resisting white terrorism with weapons. And also they were a part of Black resistance to slavery. In other words, if you're escaping slavery, Harriet Tubman is the great example of this, you're likely to have one or more pistols with you. So that's one piece of the Black tradition. The other has to do with poverty and the South. South has always been filled with poor people, and Blacks especially have been a part of that population of poor people. And people use guns to put food on the table. Simple as that. I stayed with a family back in '62, elderly couple, the McDonald's. Mr. McDonald always had a shotgun handy and a few other weapons. And one of the things they did, and it never even occurred to me that people did this, was either he or his wife sat on the back porch with a rifle shooting varmints who were eating the crops that were growing in their backyard. So it's a deep part of Southern culture and Black culture, which is enough to say about that. The upsurge in gun sales today is not surprising. I mean, there was an upsurge, believe it or not, in the South in the 1960s of weapons, because there was an upsurge in the South after World War II. With soldiers coming home, an upsurge of white terrorism after the 1954 Supreme Court decision. So you saw, and it's interesting because the South was segregated, but they sold guns to anybody. It was just a part of the culture. So whether you were Black or white, you could walk into the hardware store and buy a rifle or a shotgun. Alabama for a time, or some counties in Alabama for a time, tried to limit the sale of bullets to Black people. And there's an interesting story about how there was like an underground network of Blacks from Alabama, particularly from Lowndes County, part of the diaspora, who were living in Chicago and Detroit, coming home with shells and pistols for their family in the South. So you see this upsurge, and what you're seeing now is a reaction to the way President Trump encouraged, and I say this all the time, encouraged anti-Black terrorism in this country. And blacks respond to it just the way they've always responded to upsurges in white terrorism. There's no surprises in this. There are more black gun clubs now than there ever have been. There are more hired black gun sales than there ever been. A lot of this can be specifically attributed to the kind of country that Donald Trump has created.
Charlie, do you ever think about that quote, I think in your book, from Frederick Douglass about the ballot? Do you remember what that quote is?
Oh yeah. He said, what we need, he's talking about black people, are the ballot box. I forget the second thing. And the last thing he said is the cartridge box. And that was within the context of the growth of Ku Klux Klan terrorism. The ballot box, the cartridge box, and I don't know why I'm forgetting the third element in that quote. It's been so long since I wrote that book or had occasion to refer to that specific. But there are lots of quotes like that. Fannie Lou Hamer is the one I use a lot because Mrs. Hamer has a very specific image in civil rights history. But one evening, Mrs. Hamer is talking to us, the 19 and 20-year-olds and whatnot, and we're pondering what to do about the growth of terrorism up in the Mississippi Delta. And Mrs. Hamer said, and I quote her exactly here, she says, "I keep a shotgun in every corner of my bedroom. And the first cracker try and break into my house won't write his mama again." That's a Southern attitude. And, I use Mrs. Hamer, but it could have been anybody. I've sat with people cleaning their guns, talking about they're a part of the nonviolent movement.
Charlie, it's the jury box is the third one, the jury box.
Yeah, the ballot box, the jury box, and the cartridge box is what Douglas said.
Dr. Light, and I say, you said I can call you Caroline, but Dr. Light makes it sound like you came here from the planet Krypton to talk to us. Dr. Light, you write about, well, it's interesting because, when you think of great love affairs, you might think of Mark Antony, Cleopatra, Bogey and Bacall. You write about the love affair between America and guns, right? You teach on that. Your book is titled to that. And one of the things you talk about is the Castle Law. So when we go really far back, can you explain what that is? And then as we go forward, how Stand Your Ground really was not meant to apply to Black people being able to stand their ground, right?
Right, absolutely. And just one slight correction, it's the love affair with self-defense, specifically lethal self-defense, that I homed in on, and that guns were like secondary characters in the research that I did, but inspired in part by the work of Charlie Cobb and many others who have documented this long tradition of especially Black armed self-protection. I looked into the genealogy of stand your ground laws. And now, for those who don't know, these are the relatively contemporary laws that have now spread to some 37, I think, on last count, states that provide, quote, law-abiding citizens, and we can unpack that, the right to, quote, stand their ground and not retreat when they perceive a threat in any place they may legally be. This is outside their homes or their castles. So Matt, to your question about the Castle Doctrine, I found that the genealogy of these laws extends way back centuries and centuries ago in English common law doctrine, which says that essentially a man's home is his castle. And therefore, when you're in your own home or your castle, you shouldn't have to retreat in the face of violence or threats. And so in the King's England, you had to retreat from danger, but you didn't have to do that in your house starting in the early 17th century. We here in what would become the United States, a settler, colonial, racial capitalist patriarchy, adapted that Castle Doctrine into what would become this nation. And we adapted it in ways that specifically allowed lethal self-defense to be concentrated into the hands of already empowered individuals, specifically, not only, but particularly white propertied men. So that meant that, as we probably know, in the colonial Americas, indigenous people whose homes were under threat by Anglo settlers did not have the legal authority to use lethal defense to deflect those attacks on their homes and their families. And certainly people who were enslaved and forcibly trafficked across the Atlantic Ocean and forced into slavery did not have the right to protect their bodies or their homes from violence and from assaults by white people. So there's a long legacy in this nation. And I do want to also amplify patriarchy as an issue as well, where women of whatever ethnic or racial background and class had very little right to defend themselves against especially the men that they lived with and who were supposed to love and protect them. So the Castle Doctrine at the end of the day is already full of various often under-acknowledged power dynamics that concentrate this so-called universal right of self-defense disproportionately into already empowered hands. So when we think about the histories like the ones that Mr. Cobb has done such a great job of illuminating for us, we have to think about that against this larger backdrop of white supremacy, of racial capitalism, of settler colonialism, and heteropatriarchy that make it very difficult when minoritized people try to stand their ground against more powerful or socially, economically, politically powerful individuals in the nation.
Thank you. And so that brings me to Abené, who writes for The Guardian. You do not have a British accent.
Unfortunately, no, not yet. I'm working on it.
You're in Northern California. So just, we were talking about it before, but in one of the interviews I heard with you, tell us about your childhood and when you talk about the games that you played as a kid.
Yeah, so I grew up in Richmond, California, a small to medium-sized city right in the proper Bay Area near San Francisco, Berkeley, Oakland, all that good kind of stuff. And when I was a kid, growing up, I just kind of knew that gun violence, I didn't even call it gun violence. When I was a kid, people get shot, you know what I'm saying? The guns are around, and that's just something I grew up knowing. And when and then when I was, outside playing kids game along with Foursquare and Capture the Flag, there was a game we played called Drive By, and we would see a car just making a roundabout, a car that lost its way and found its way into our cul-de-sac, and if it was driving back slowly, that would indicate to us like, it's a drive-by. And my friends, who can run behind a car faster, who can duck, who can get down, like there are all these things that we were doing that for us were fun, and we thought it was a game. We were having a good time. We were enjoying our youth, but it's so unfortunate that like the kind of specter of gun violence was like so entrenched in that we would think it was a game. There are so many things to do outside. Like kids should not be thinking about drive-bys, but not only was it a reality in my community, it's what you see on television. When you see a community that looks like yours, that's where the drive-bys were happening. When I saw other Black people on screen so often, it was in a community where there was a drive-by, be it in LA or Oakland. So yeah, it was fun back then, but terrible to think of now.
Did that get you to write the series that you're writing now for The Guardian? Was that part of the motivation for you to get involved in this?
Not directly. That honestly, the things from childhood are new revelations, honestly, that I've had from doing kind of a number of interviews in the past few weeks as kind of high profile mass shootings have come back to the fore in the news cycle. But The inspiration more so came from the local reporting that I was doing. I talk about, I was pretty much just like a metro reporter in Richmond. I go to city council meetings, this new store is opening, just kind of, everyday community reporting stuff, and things that were like nonprofits, or even if it was a for-profit business, in the backdrop, they would talk about, we're trying to get this going to have something for people to do and have something for people to hope for so that gun violence will decrease. It could be about literacy rates. It could be about healthy food options, all those kind of things. Like reducing gun violence was a major motivation for things that you may not associate with it. And that's just something I found really interesting. In doing that same reporting, I would actually have to report on gun violence and talk to families, and I would go to vigils, and that's how I just met a lot of people. And I realized how interconnected everything was, and that those connections were not being discussed in a helpful way in the news that I was reading and seeing. So that's really where it came from. But like I said, I guess I was kind of made for this job since I was playing drive-by when I was 10. One of the natural progression.
I think it's in your reporting, Abené, is that this incredible increase in gun ownership. By the way, somebody's asking what percentage of the 22 million guns last year were bought by Black people. I know that the increase was 56%. I don't know offhand. But in your reporting, I think it's that very often when Black people go to shooting ranges, for example, they're still treated differently than white people. So they bought guns, they're practicing with their guns, they're going to shooting ranges, and they're still treated differently. Is that right?
100%. I went to a Black gun owners chapter here in the Bay Area. And, when I went back to interview everyone for the story, a common refrain was not just at gun ranges, but at actual gun stores. When they would go in person, they were either completely dismissed or talked to as if they were born yesterday, and the funniest thing was they would be spoken to as if they were children, when at the same time not being offered any sort of like instruction or help. I talked to a woman who got a gun, like many people did. They saw threats of food shortages. They didn't know if it was going to be bedlam out here in the beginning of the pandemic. So she went and got herself a gun because she lived alone. And she said that she went in, was clear. She was like, I don't know what I want. I don't know what I'm doing. I just know I feel unsafe. And they gave her a random pistol, didn't even see if it would fit her hands, if she knew what to do with it, and kind of just sent her on her way, which is incredibly unsafe for so many reasons. So that coupled with, going to the range and there's mostly white people there, and you show up as a Black person, maybe in your own kind of tactical gear, trying to look the part, and you're spoken to in a way that another kind of anecdote, a guy told me that when he went, he felt like his experience was as they were talking to him like, oh, let me help this boy out. Let me do what I can. This is how you do it. Just really being talked down to in a way that made him feel very uncomfortable. And he put his guard up, which makes it more difficult to learn. So, it was like at gun ranges and at shooting places, they were definitely treated very apathetically at the store. So pretty much like every chain of the gun purchasing, from the store to the range, and then the way that, Black people are criminalized often for having guns. So once you are an owner, there's that as well. And then I'm so glad that Dr. Light spoke on like the patriarchy, because then these issues were even worse for women, for Black women. They would, figure out, okay, I'm going to go, Black women, we will support a Black business. If we find out Black people are doing something, we're going to go and support it. But then you go into these spaces where there's majority Black men. And I honestly experienced it for myself. And they'd say, oh, we'll give you the girl gun, let me show you how to hold it. And you're literally getting hit on while you're trying to figure out how to protect yourself from a home intruder. So like those, that intersectionality was at the forefront that I highlighted in the reporting as well. So it was just, in short, a mess, a racist, patriarchal mess.
And then I think Charlie and Dr. Light, very few gun stores even now are Black owned, right? So
yeah. I don't have a number. I mean, I can't say this percentage or this number, but very few are. In Jacksonville, where I live, where there are lots of gun stores, I can't think of a single one that's owned by a Black person. I can think of gun stores owned by Black people in other parts of the country, in the South, but in this city, and I don't know what that represents in terms of overall But as far as I know, there are no Black-owned gun stores here in Jacksonville, Florida, which is a gun city. I mean, this is gun city, believe me.
I mean, I think we are seeing, I mean, thanks to, the journalistic efforts of Abené and others, where we are seeing an uptick in Black women-owned gun clubs and training centers and online communities that do focus on not just having firearms or procuring firearms, but using them and storing them safely. And I think in really careful and precise recognition of the statistics that show often that having a gun in the house, raises your risk of having somebody misuse that gun if you don't safely store it. So I've been gratified actually to see this, what seems like, and I don't have data for this, and I think that is one of our problems or our challenges in gun violence resistance, is that the data is really hard to get. I do see more Black women and women of color engaged in safe gun owning practices, which I think is a really good thing, especially given, how little our dominant culture provides in the way of allowing Black women the right to protect themselves and their homes and their families. And there's, of course, a long history with that. So it does feel like anecdotally there are more Black women taking this effort into their own capable hands.
In the South that I worked in half a century ago, I mean, it was not uncommon for women to have guns, it just wasn't. I mean, yes, I mean, men had guns, and probably a lot of men had guns that they'd brought home after having served in World War II. But it was not uncommon for women in the rural South where I worked to have guns. And those guns were almost always for self-defense. Women did not go out hunting to put food on the table or even shoot varmints in the backyard garden. Almost all the guns, because I helped a lady check into a motel once in Atlantic City, New Jersey. Black woman. She was a janitor at a public high school in Mississippi, in Jackson. And as she's fumbling at the desk, a pistol fell out of her pocketbook. And I asked her, I said, well, Miss Palmer, you're not in Mississippi now. Why do you have this pistol? And her response, and I remember it exactly, was, I don't know these people, Charlie. And this was the attitude of a lot of women who felt themselves being in dangerous places. Now, I don't know how much of that is true today, but it was true back when I was a young man working in the South.
And Charlie, you had mentioned that in the 1960s, it seemed like there was a big increase in Black gun ownership. There was obviously a lot of turmoil in the 1960s. So we're attributing what happened in the last year with gun ownership to all the turmoil that's going on in the country. Do you see this as a long-term trend or short-term?
It's hard to predict. I mean, it really is. I mean, and the reason it's hard to predict to me is because guns in the United States are such a part of the culture. They've been romanticized in a way that's unique in the entire world, guns and violence. And I have a whole lecture on this. I think Rap Brown, who was the fifth chairman of SNCC, had it right when he said to a reporter, gun violence is as American as cherry pie. So it's hard. While I see an increase of guns, certainly in my city, Jacksonville, Florida, because of the poisonous atmosphere that Trump generated, it's hard to predict that if this eases, there'll be a decline in the acquisition of guns and weapons, because guns are a part of the culture in a way that's just unlike. I've traveled all over the world, and unlike any other place I've ever been in, guns are romanticized here. and what that means in terms of future acquisition or of weapons is hard. It's hard for me anyway to predict.
I can mention while we're here that there was already a shooting today at a middle school in Idaho where 3 people, 2 kids and a person who worked at the school were shot just this morning. I think everybody's going to survive. But when Chief Bratton, when he was opening before, talked about how we're afraid to check our Twitter account or turn on the TV, this is exactly what he was referring to. We do have a couple of questions. One question is, any idea as to what percentage of Black households own guns? I don't know the answer to that one.
A majority of my neighborhood. I live in an inner city neighborhood. The people who live in it are retired and working class people. This is not a neighborhood, and it's on the edge of gentrification. So there's a smattering of younger people coming into the neighborhood. And most houses in this neighborhood have a gun in them.
There's also a question here that we get from Joseph Comfort. I was fascinated to learn that the foundation of the Black Panthers was based in policing the police. After the incident at the Sacramento State House where armed Panthers entered the House chambers, laws were passed against carrying weapons in cities where the Panthers were active. Mm-hmm. Any comment on that? That's interesting.
Well, it was a state law that was passed banning concealed weapons, banning open carry, I should say, open carry. The Panthers were legally within their right to show up at the Capitol wearing the bandoliers and the black, I remember it vividly, black berets and the black leather jackets and all that. Ronald Reagan was the governor, and he quickly pushed through the California legislature a law forbidding the open carry of weapons, because the Panthers were also patrolling the police with their weapons held openly, and there was nothing the police could do to stop them because it was legal. And there was no objection from the National Rifle Association, and there was no objection from any of the usual voices today that we associate with opposition to restriction of gun rights.
And can I add the punchline to that, Charlie?
Mm-hmm.
What happens to Ronald Reagan later is that he becomes the very first president elected with the full support of the National Rifle Association, even after passing this very restrictive state gun law.
Yes.
The ironies abound.
Right. Your stories are titled Guns and Lies, right?
Yeah. Sorry, say that again?
The lies part of it.
Oh, there's lots of lies. The lie, the main one that I came in to address is a very basic and racist lie, which is when people will ask, well, why does gun violence happen in neighborhoods, in certain neighborhoods in Oakland and LA? Then people will simply say, because there are more Black people there. That is the answer. Just simply the racial makeup of a place makes it the most likely to deal with these insane levels of gun violence, when I know that that isn't true. And it's a very frustrating and racist lie that people still believe, that there is something within Black and also within the Latino community, because they are also overrepresented in terms of gun deaths and non-fatal injuries. There's just this idea that you get a bunch of Black and brown people together and just violence is going to happen, that these are folks who just have these violent tendencies, and it's wrong. And I honestly, it's like I'm getting some like eugenics energy in there as well. Thank you. Caroline feels me. Another, some of the other lies that I've kind of learned as time goes on is that there's one of the most recent kind of lies or misnomers that I've come across is just kind of the overstating of the value of these kind of reflexive laws that people want, like universal background checks and assault weapons bans. These are things that are always called upon after a high-profile mass shooting. And I say high-profile because mass shootings happen all over the place on city blocks, and they don't get the same level of coverage. But after a high-profile mass shooting, you know they're going to ask for universal background checks for these sort of accountability measures to be put on gun dealers. These things, people, and in a lot of people's minds, I genuinely think that, folks believe that as soon as, congressional Republicans act and universal background laws are passed and assault weapons ban is passed, then gun violence will stop. And that is completely untrue. I think it might be helpful for perhaps research purposes, you know what I'm saying? But first of all, most gun deaths are suicides, number one, and that's something that people often don't know. And then after that, it is, community violence, the shootings that I write about. And those are most often, it might be changing a little bit now because of like ghost guns and stuff, but usually it's a handgun. You know what I'm saying? Like handguns were seen as the weapon of choice for quote unquote the inner city, ne'er-do-well, if you will. I learned that they were called Saturday night specials recently, which was a term that I had no clue about. And there's this very long history of criminalizing this particular weapon, and it's still criminalized, but assault weapons have taken the majority of the conversation. There's lots come to mind, but mostly it's like the racism and the overstatement of these kind of high level federal laws and the impact that would actually have on the most prominent forms of gun violence, which they would have very little effect on.
Yeah, and we should say, there's a really important date here to understand a major change in how gun control and the issue of gun rights is used as a political instrument. And that's with the takeover of the National Rifle Association in 1977, in what is sometimes called the Revolt of Cincinnati, in Cincinnati. And really it was a right-wing extremist takeover of that organization, which changed the NRA from what it was when I was a kid, an organization that taught gun safety and had you could get training. I remember at my school, representatives of the NRA came to the school inviting us to participate in training sessions. It was largely based a fairly conservative organization that dealt with issues of conservation, hunting, gun safety, et cetera. That changes after 1977. And that's really, and this is the point that's missed, it was really a part of a growing right-wing political surge that began with Barry Goldwater in 1964 and continued with Ronald Reagan in the 1960s, reacting to the anti-war movement, the feminist movement, the civil rights movement, Black Power, the Black Panther Party, and all of these movements. There had never been in this society, as far as I know, and I'm not a scholar in this, gun rights was never an issue in this society until after then. And it became an issue because it was linked to these movements that the advocates of extremist views about the Second Amendment also did not like, particularly civil rights, Black Power, feminism, gay rights, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. That's when we see a marked change in the political conversation about guns. When I was a kid, you had one or you didn't have one. I had a BB gun. My parents gave me a BB gun. It was a big deal. The only thing I got from them was don't point it at anybody because you might put out somebody's eye if the pellet went. That was it. Other than that, they had no concerns about me walking around the neighborhood with a BB gun or going. Never mind. That's a whole nother conversation we don't have time for.
So you're talking about gun deaths of the 42,500 in 2020. 22,000 almost were suicides, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
That's yes. Those when somebody's committing suicide, they don't commit suicide with an assault weapon.
No, it's not. It's not. There's no AR-15s usually found at the the scene of a suicide. And that does bring up another lie, that most gun deaths, disproportionately, homicides, yes, are, Black and Latino young men. But when it comes to suicides, there's been maybe a little bit of change, but it's mostly white men on the other end of 50 in rural places that are killing themselves, honestly. And that is something that for a number of reasons, I don't think journalists and newsrooms have issues talking about suicides for a lot of reasons. But even among that kind of NRA community, I think it's so interesting what Charlie just said. I had no idea that there was this very intentional shift. You would think that the NRA may perhaps include their clientele, if you will, in this conversation about suicide, because those are the people who are, when we talk about risk factors, it's white men on, like I said, the other side of 50 who are dying, who are killing themselves, and usually it's with a gun. So that's another lie that in the coming months we hope to uplift a little more and kind of move that conversation forward, like we have with some other things. But that's a really tough topic for newsrooms to address ethically.
Well, you also bring up the issue when we talk about suicides. For example, there have been a few articles lately that say that there were no mass shootings last year, and now there are all these mass shootings. There were more mass shootings last year than there were ever before. They just taken place at the supermarket, right?
You just struck a serious nerve. Yeah, because that's something right after Atlanta and Colorado. It was so troubling for me to hear people say, like, gun violence is back. It's happening. Things are getting these very flippant comments. And one of the most frustrating things is that it came from a lot of like progressive leftist, you know what I'm saying, believing in the social safety net type of folks who usually, I don't know, maybe expect to have a kind of more nuanced view of this, but it was mostly those folks who I saw on Twitter saying, like, our first mass shooting in who knows how long, like they got to experience this cooling off period that did not exist for so many communities. And that is something that when I hear, even in interviews and things like that, people will say, like, it felt like gun violence was gone. And I was like, well, yeah, because most of the gun violence that was happening was the stuff that was never covered in the first place, besides by anyone but like local reporters. And, there's some really good efforts coming out of the Washington Post. The Trace does amazing work, but it's a very small population of reporters who focus on this kind of stuff. So it ground my gears to hear people say, like, we're back to the new normal of gun violence. Mass shootings have made a return when multiple people are shot on city blocks all the time. It's a mass shooting. And finally, people are calling those mass shootings. Before they were just called like gang crimes or just like a street shooting. And it's like, finally, we've moved past that, and it only took, X amount of years to do so. But another lie. Thank you, Matt.
Can I chime in real quick?
Yeah.
I wanted to thank Abené because, like, I was actually teaching a course this last semester on guns in the United States, and then your article came out, which said exactly what I wanted to teach my students about the relative, not invisibility, but media or whatever, illiteracy when it comes to seeing
that's the word
violence. And it's like, it blew my mind. And actually my students, to their great credit, they noticed, they're like, what? Gun violence never went anywhere. It's just people weren't paying attention. And so I have just a quick question for you, Abené. Do you see us turning the corner on that as a society? Do you think we're ready now to really see the actual sources of gun violence for what they are? I mean, thanks to your efforts and many others, I mean, are we starting to wake up to the realities of gun violence in this nation? Or are we still sleeping?
That's interesting. I think that people have been more ready, willing, and wanting to talk about it after, like I said, after that article. Are you talking about the opinion piece? Everything about the gun debate is wrong. That
one.
Yeah, I've been kind of beating this drum for the last couple of years, and it hadn't really gone outside of the circles of people who were already deeply invested in getting this right. So I do think that within the journalism community, there is more intention and effort Columbia Journalism Review is trying to do some really great work. There are more conversations happening. I think the fact that I personally have been interviewed about this topic and can talk about it to folks who were under the impression that gun violence had stopped is a really good sign. But honestly, I'm just very cynical about this kind of stuff because there's always this explosion of energy, this explosion of conversation. And then the next time, God forbid, but likely will, the next time we have a high profile shooting, I just hope that we don't start from square one, I don't know that, I feel like after the most recent high profile mass shootings, there was this initial effort to say, all of these shootings happened in that in-between time. And I love those in-between time stories because they tell us more about the US than a story about a high profile shooting, I think, ever could. But those die down, there has to be a concerted effort. I cover this topic, as my job, and not everyone does. So I would just hope that the fervor for going beyond popular narratives continues. And then once there is, like I said, God forbid, but likely there will be another high profile mass shooting, will one know how to cover that better? And there will already be kind of a body of that in between time work so that it won't feel like such a disparity in attention when, of course, the majority of media attention goes to that new shooting, but we won't know for a while. I personally think the conversation is moving forward in journalism circles, which is, I think, where it kind of needs to start for the rest of the U.S. to kind of come along on the train.
I have a less hopeful view, I guess. Inner cities, where so much of the inner cities and urban areas where so much violence unfolds, gun violence, remain invisible. And that invisibility, makes me extremely doubtful that the kind of violence that infects those communities will be meaningfully pursued, looks at them. I hope you're right. I hope I'm wrong. But I feel that they remain invisible. These places, the whys of it, and all of that remain undiscussed. I mean, nobody really talks about the kind of violence that ravages these communities. Like in Jacksonville, there's a group, Mad Dads. And their thing is campaigning against the violence. Yeah. And nobody in media pays attention to them. Mm-hmm. And therefore, for the most part, only a handful of interested people like me pay attention to them.
So,
you're 100% right.
We have a bunch of things that I want to get to just before we do that. The LA Times, somebody wrote an op-ed about a month ago, and it said, there were no mass shootings last year, and now we're having all these mass shootings. This was an op-ed in the LA Times. And I did write a letter back to them, and I think publish it because I didn't use any words that could be published. So,
take up that mantle. Take it up. Take up that issue, because that is, like I said, a gripe that I have.
So I'm going to go through some questions. The first one, and I just want to dissuade this person of this thought that he had. He says, am I hearing you all correctly? We're saying it's a good idea for more people to own guns, this given all the dangerous issues we know coexist. And I think that's not what we're saying. I think we're saying that more people own guns. Mm-hmm. We're not saying that it's good. We're just stating the fact that it's happening, right?
Right.
Yeah, absolutely. I don't know that having more guns, especially if it's like guns being bought purely for reaction. When I talked to, there's the one Black-owned gun store in California, and I got to talk to them. And I was like, are you happy to see this? Are you encouraged? And they're like, yeah, it's good for business, but I just worry that the people who are buying them aren't going to care about guns once things die down and people are back to having a good time. And that's how that really can end up fueling what's going on in inner city communities. Folks get lazy with their guns, they get stolen, they get lost, they get in a hand-to-hand sale, and it's all bad. So I don't think that, from what I know of this group, that anyone is advocating for more people to go out and buy weapons. But it's a reality that it is, in fact, happening. But I don't think it's encouraged
and
by
just to add to that, all the statistical evidence coming out of criminology, coming out of my field history, coming out of public health shows beyond a reasonable doubt a correlation of more guns in circulation leading to more gun death, whether we're talking about suicides or homicides or accidental deaths. We haven't even talked about kids and accidental shootings. It's clear that the more guns we infuse into our society, the more gun deaths there are going to continue to be. I think part of the point of what we're saying is that when minoritized communities in particular start accumulating firearms, it is in response to these larger socio-cultural and historical, traditions of criminalization of poverty, of criminalization of blackness, of racial terror. So it's kind of like to show what are the factors that are driving so many people of color to the gun stores, and yet at the same time to hold space for just the facts and the statistics that show that I don't think guns are necessarily going to make us safer.
There's a question here from Christina Files who asks about smart technology and smart guns. I would only say to you, stay tuned for the 3:45 Eastern panel when that is going to be covered, smart technology. Dr. Light, somebody writes, I really appreciated your focus on power structures, white supremacy, patriarchy structure, who has a right to defend themselves against whom. How can we get rid of stand your ground laws? They will and are used against black and brown people.
That's the $1 million question, and I don't know. And I will say that I was naive, and when I published that book, I think I had the suspicion that in the wake of all the outrage, especially around Trayvon Martin's murder and the acquittal of his killer, based on stand your ground laws and their kind of exonerary rhetoric, I thought that people would stand up and resist stand your ground laws in substantive ways that would end up eliminating them. And it was very naive of me. And I admit I'm wrong, because now we've seen them spread to 37 states. So I don't want to be the complete pessimist, but I do think it's going to take a tremendous amount of popular protest, of voting our frustrations by bringing people into office who are going to resist those kinds of discourses, which are based on this spurious notion that self-defense, lethal self-defense, is and always has been a universal right of everyone, that it's a great equalizer. It's anything but. Self-defense has always been concentrated in the hands of the powerful and deployed against disproportionately, structurally more vulnerable people. So I wish I knew. And if you have any ideas, hit me up.
I just want to say very quickly that the answer to this is part of the organizing mission that today's young activists have to take on, because clearly you have to replace these legislatures that pass these laws. We have a Congress that's cowardly, and we have state legislatures that defer to the lowest common denominator as long as it keeps them in office. The only way around that problem, which is what really these stand your ground laws are linked to, has to do with organizing to get rid of these legislatures. And that's, it's difficult, but that's the only answer. Left alone, don't depend on anything from these guys.
So speaking of young people, there's a question here. Young voters are seeing a rise in suicides. It's not a statement, as well as some younger people who are not veterans. So that's talking about the incredibly high number of suicides with a gun. There's another question here. Are the high violence communities able to address the gun problem without media awareness or any other outside assistance?
They have been doing it for so long, and they've been doing it on in organizations and individuals of all sizes. So that is another another thing that I like to debunk in my work is that no one's doing anything about this, that it's going to take a Moms Demand Action type grouper in every time one of these large national groups to address what's going on. I refer to it as the hood, but, that's whatever, because that's where I'm from. But in the hood, there are so many individuals. I know of so many, mostly women who lose a child to gun violence, figure out a way and heal themselves, usually on their own or in community with other Black women. And then after they find out someone else has a child who's been killed, they will take food over there. They will provide their own sort of informal therapy. A lot of the times, a lot of Black people get rejected from getting victims compensation because in a police report, if they say that there's any inkling of the victim being involved in whatever events led up to their own death, then they get no money. So there's no support for any time off of work and all these different kind of things. And there are people who are taking it upon themselves to address and heal these folks, and also people who are taking it upon themselves to take kids on field trips, to step up, to do these different sort of things. And it all happens usually without any city money, usually on volunteer dollars or something out of someone's paycheck. And they're doing this and it's working. There are targeted violence intervention programs that exist on shoestring budgets that are saving cities millions of dollars that get zero attention. And it's tough. They make it happen. But I hope that with my work in uplifting these things and showing that there are demonstrably helpful, that perhaps legislation, perhaps people with some decision-making power can kind of step away from arguing over laws and start to just fund some of the programs and the people that are making things happen. And I hope it happens without media attention, because I'm feeling like Charlie right now. I'm a little pessimistic that folks are going to catch on, but it needs to be funded regardless.
Well, Abené, in your writing, you make it clear that you think that community intervention is the best way.
100%.
And I think, isn't it correct that the current administration has put together $5 billion to address community issues?
Yes. In the infrastructure bill. And one thing that I kind of will applaud Joe Biden for is that it's in the jobs package. When people ask me what I hope happens with gun violence, I always say fund and train violence intervention workers who know how to go and get at and wrap their arms around the people who are deemed to be the most dangerous in a city, the people most likely to be shooters if they haven't already shot someone, the people whose social services are like, we don't know what to do with this person. And when they end up dead or in prison, like, that's it. People who have had, who have been given up on, and to hire folks to help and support these people sustainably is something that I think is so valuable. It's one of the only jobs where being formally incarcerated is a prerequisite. You know what I'm saying? Like, people want folks who have maybe gone down for a gun crime and who are juvenile lifers and things like this.
I'm in the middle of a Zoom call right now. But it should soon be over, and I'll give you a ring back.
But we're going to wrap this, but I want to leave. We have a file in the area. And Christina says, DC successfully reduced homicides from a high of 360 in the mid-90s to less than 100 by 2000 due to actions by community-based violence reduction organizations. That's an example. I think Charlie's got a lot of people calling him. They're seeing him on this, obviously, and they want to tell him.
Yeah.
We're going to go. There's another panel that starts in a couple of minutes, so I'm going to end this one here. I just have to say thank you. You're all amazing.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Okay.
It was a pleasure.
So thank you to everybody. Much appreciated. All right. Your information is incredible, and it's much appreciated.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.